The sun burned high over the rocky slopes of Mount Carmel. Thousands of people had gathered across the dusty hillside. Farmers, soldiers, merchants, and families stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. The air felt heavy with expectation. At the center of the crowd stood a single man. His clothes were simple. His hair was wild from years spent in the wilderness. In his hand he held a wooden staff worn smooth by time. This man was Elijah, a prophet of the God of Israel. But he stood alone. Across from him were 450 prophets of Baal, the powerful god many people in Israel had begun to worship. They wore colorful robes and stood confidently beside a large stone altar prepared for sacrifice. Behind them stood the royal guards of Ahab, the king who ruled Israel. It was Ahab and his queen who had encouraged the nation to abandon the God of their ancestors and follow Baal instead. Now the entire nation had come to watch what would happen next. Elijah stepped forward. His voice carried across the mountain like a thunderclap. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he called out to the people. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." The crowd fell silent. No one answered. Elijah raised his hand and pointed to the altars that stood ready on the mountain. "Bring 2 bulls," he said. "Let the prophets of Baal choose one for themselves. Let them place it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and place it on the altar of the Lord." He paused, letting the tension build. "Then you call on the name of your God," Elijah said, looking toward the prophets of Baal. "And I will call on the name of the Lord." The wind swept across the mountain. Then Elijah declared the challenge that would decide everything. The God who answers by fire, he is the true God. The people murmured among themselves. And slowly, the crowd began to nod. The challenge had begun.
Long before that day on Mount Carmel, something had gone terribly wrong in the land of Israel. This was a nation that once walked closely with God. They had seen miracles in the wilderness. They had crossed seas that split apart before them. They had been guided, protected, and provided for in ways no other nation had ever experienced. But over time, their hearts began to drift. It did not happen all at once. At first, it was small compromises. A shrine built here. A quiet prayer whispered there. A curiosity about the gods of surrounding nations. Then came influence. When Ahab became king, everything changed faster. He did something no king before him had done so boldly. He married Jezebel, a foreign princess who worshipped Baal, a god believed to control rain, storms, and fertility. To her, Baal was not just a belief. It was power. And she brought that power into Israel. Under her influence, temples to Baal were built. Altars were raised. Prophets of Baal were fed and honored in the royal court. Meanwhile, the prophets of the true God were hunted down. Many were forced into hiding. Others were silenced. Fear spread across the land. Soon, worship of Baal became normal. It became easier, more acceptable, more popular. People began to think, maybe we can follow both. They still remembered the God of their ancestors, but now they also bowed to Baal. They tried to live in 2 worlds at once. And that was the real danger. Because slowly, without even realizing it, their loyalty shifted. Rain came, and they thanked Baal. Crops grew, and they praised Baal. Storms passed, and they feared Baal. The God who had delivered them was being forgotten. But not by everyone. There was still one voice that refused to be silent. A man who would not compromise. A man who would not bow. That man was Elijah. He had already stood before King Ahab once before and delivered a bold message. There will be no rain in this land except at my word. And just like that, the skies had closed. For years, drought covered Israel. The land dried up. Crops failed. Rivers shrank. And still, the people did not fully turn back. Now, after years of silence, Elijah had returned. Not with a whisper, but with a challenge that would force the entire nation to choose. No more mixing. No more pretending. No more standing in between. On that mountain, everything would be revealed. And the question that had lingered in every heart would finally be answered. Who is the true God? The drought had lasted for years. The land of Israel, once full of life, had become dry and fragile. Cracked soil stretched across fields that used to produce abundance. Rivers had thinned into weak streams. Wells ran low. Hunger and fear lingered in every village. And yet, the people still hesitated. Even after everything, they had not fully turned back to God. That is when Elijah returned. He did not come quietly. He went straight to Ahab, the king who had led Israel into this spiritual collapse. When Ahab saw him, his face hardened with anger. "Is that you?" the king said bitterly. "You troubler of Israel?" But Elijah did not flinch. "I have not made trouble for Israel," he replied calmly. "You and your father's house have. You have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed Baal." The words cut through the air like a blade. No one spoke to the king like that. But Elijah was not finished. He stepped closer and issued a command that would shake the entire nation. "Now summon all Israel," Elijah said, his voice steady and unshaken. "Bring them to Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." This was no small request. This was a public confrontation, a moment where everything would be exposed. Ahab hesitated, but something in Elijah's authority made it impossible to refuse. Messengers were sent throughout the land. From cities, villages, and fields, people began to gather. They came out of curiosity, out of fear, out of desperation. They had lived through years of drought. They had prayed to Baal for rain, and nothing had changed. Now, something different was about to happen. When the day came, the mountain filled with people, and at the center stood Elijah, alone. On the other side stood the prophets of Baal, hundreds of them, confident and united. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One man against hundreds. Then Elijah stepped forward. He did not speak to the prophets first. He spoke to the people. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he called out, his voice echoing across the mountain. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "If the Lord is God, follow him," Elijah continued. "But if Baal is God, then follow him." Silence. No one answered. No one moved. Because deep down they knew. They had been trying to live in both worlds. To believe in God and still depend on Baal. To hold on to truth while chasing what was easier. Elijah looked across the crowd. This was the moment. "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left," he said, "but Baal has 450 prophets." He turned and pointed to the altars. "Let 2 bulls be brought to us. Let them choose one and prepare it. Place it on the wood, but do not set fire to it." The prophets of Baal nodded. This was familiar ground for them. Then Elijah continued, "I will prepare the other bull and place it on the altar of the Lord. I will not set fire to it either." The wind began to rise across the mountain. Every eye was now fixed on him. "Then you call on the name of your God," Elijah said, gesturing toward the prophets. "And I will call on the name of the Lord." He paused. The tension was thick. Then came the words that would define the day. "The God who answers by fire. He is the true God." For a moment, everything stood still. Then the people responded. What he said made sense. It was fair. It was clear. It left no room for excuses. And slowly, voices began to rise from the crowd. "That is a good idea," they said. The challenge had been accepted. Now, all that remained was to see who would answer. The air on Mount Carmel grew still. All eyes turned toward the prophets of Baal. They moved forward with confidence. After all, this was their moment. They were many. They were trained. They had performed rituals like this before. And today, they believed Baal would answer. A bull was brought forward. The prophets carefully prepared it, cutting it into pieces and placing it upon the wood of their altar. Everything was arranged perfectly, but there was one rule. No fire. The altar stood ready, waiting. Elijah stepped back and gestured for them to begin. "Call on the name of your God," he said. The prophets of Baal lifted their hands. At first, their voices were calm. "Baal, answer us." The words echoed across the mountain. The crowd watched closely. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The prophets grew louder. "Baal, answer us." They began to move, circling the altar in rhythm. Their voices rose into chants. Their steps became faster, more intense. Dust kicked up around their feet as they danced. Still nothing. The sun climbed higher into the sky. Heat pressed down on everyone standing there. But the prophets did not stop. Their chanting turned into shouting. Their shouting turned into desperate cries. "Baal, hear us." They raised their arms to the sky, begging, pleading. But the sky gave no answer. No thunder. No spark. No flame. Only silence. From morning until noon, they continued. And then, something unexpected happened. Elijah began to speak. Not with fear. Not with anger. But with sharp, cutting sarcasm. "Shout louder," he called out to them. The crowd stirred, surprised. "Surely he is a god." Elijah continued. "Maybe he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling." A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Elijah wasn't done. "Perhaps he is sleeping," he added, "and must be awakened." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the people. The prophets of Baal, however, took his words seriously. They shouted louder. Their voices became wild, frantic. They pushed themselves harder, desperate to prove that Baal was real. Time passed. The sun moved overhead and began to descend. Still no answer. Then, in a final act of desperation, the prophets did something extreme. They began to cut themselves. With knives and spears, they slashed their arms, their bodies, until blood flowed. It dripped onto the altar, onto the ground, mixing with the dust beneath their feet. They cried out in pain, believing that sacrifice would force their God to respond. The scene grew chaotic. Shouting, dancing, blood, desperation. It continued for hours, from noon until evening. But the result never changed. No voice, no response, no fire, only silence. The crowd, once curious, now watched in uneasy realization. All the noise, all the effort, all the intensity. And still, nothing. The prophets slowed. Their voices weakened. Their movements became unsteady. Exhaustion replaced confidence. And as the sun began to fall toward the horizon, the truth became impossible to ignore. Baal had not answered. Baal could not answer. The altar stood untouched, cold, silent, empty. And in that silence, every eye slowly turned back to Elijah. Now it was his turn. The mountain had gone quiet. The shouting was over. The frantic dancing had stopped. Even the wind seemed to slow, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. All eyes turned toward Elijah. He stepped forward calmly. No rush, no panic, no desperation. Where the prophets of Baal had filled the air with noise, Elijah brought something different. Certainty. "Come here to me," he said, motioning to the people. The crowd drew closer. Slowly at first, then in greater numbers. They gathered around him, leaving behind the failed altar of Baal, an altar that now stood as a silent reminder of empty promises. In front of them was something almost forgotten. An altar of the Lord. Broken, neglected, covered in dust and time. It had once been a place of worship. Now it was a symbol of what Israel had abandoned. Elijah knelt beside it. Without speaking, he began to rebuild, stone by stone. But this was not random. He carefully chose 12 stones, each one representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Even though the nation had been divided and scattered in heart, Elijah reminded them of something deeper. They were still one people, a people called by God, a people who had forgotten who they were. As he placed each stone, the crowd watched in silence. No shouting, no spectacle, just purpose. When the altar was complete, Elijah dug a trench around it, wide and deep enough to hold water. This was strange. Water was precious during a drought. Every drop mattered. Yet Elijah was about to use it, not to drink, not to save, but to make something harder. Then he placed the wood on the altar. Carefully, orderly. Next, the bull was prepared and laid upon the wood. Everything was ready. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Fill 4 jars with water," he said. The people hesitated. Water? On an altar meant to burn? Still, they obeyed. They poured the water over the sacrifice and the wood. It soaked through everything. The wood darkened. The ground became wet. "Do it again," Elijah said. A murmur moved through the crowd. But again, they obeyed. More water poured down, dripping, running, soaking deeper. "Do it a 3rd time." Now the tension returned. This was no ordinary act. By the 3rd pouring, everything was drenched. Water flowed down the altar, filling the trench that surrounded it. The sacrifice was completely soaked. The wood was heavy with water. There was no chance, no possibility, that fire could start on its own. This was impossible. And that was exactly the point. Elijah stepped back. He looked at the altar, then at the people. No tricks, no hidden fire, no illusion. Just a simple truth about to be revealed. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, the time of the evening sacrifice. The moment had come. The noise of Baal's prophets had failed. Now, in complete silence, Elijah prepared to speak. The moment had come. The sky over Mount Carmel burned with the fading light of evening. Shadows stretched across the ground. The air felt heavy, like the world itself was waiting. At the center stood Elijah. No chanting, no movement, no performance, just one man and a soaked altar. The wood was drenched. The sacrifice was soaked. The trench around it was filled with water. If anything was ever impossible to ignite, it was this. Elijah stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to impress the crowd. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel." Elijah began, his voice steady and calm. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your command." The crowd leaned in. No shouting, no repetition, no desperation, just a simple, direct call. "Answer me, O Lord," he continued. "Answer me, so that these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." And then, silence. A heartbeat, too. And suddenly, fire. It didn't start small. It didn't flicker. It didn't struggle. It fell. A blazing, unstoppable fire came down from heaven with terrifying force. It consumed the sacrifice instantly. The wood gone. The stones, cracked and burned. The dust, scorched away. Even the water, every single drop in the trench, vanished in a burst of steam. The entire altar was swallowed in divine fire. The crowd stumbled back in shock, eyes wide, hearts pounding. This wasn't natural. This wasn't explainable. This was power. Raw, absolute, undeniable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then suddenly, the people fell face down, all across the mountain, one by one, then all at once. "The Lord, He is God," they cried. "The Lord, He is God." Their voices rose, not in confusion this time, not in doubt, but in realization. The truth they had avoided, the truth they had ignored, was now impossible to deny. Baal had remained silent, but the living God had answered with fire. Not a whisper, not a sign, but a force so overwhelming that it erased every doubt in a single moment. And in that fire, everything changed. The silence of heaven had been broken. The hearts of the people had been shaken awake. And the God they had forgotten had just reminded them who He is. The fire was gone, but its impact remained. Smoke still rose from the scorched ground on Mount Carmel. The altar was no longer just an altar. It was a mark, a moment, a line that had just been drawn between truth and deception. The people were still on their faces. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Their voices echoed across the mountain, no longer uncertain, no longer divided. Something had shifted, deep inside them. The silence that once surrounded God had been shattered. And now, there was no going back. At the center of it all stood Elijah. He looked over the crowd, not with pride, not with triumph, but with clarity. This wasn't just about fire. This was about decision. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he had asked earlier. Now, the answer was clear. They couldn't stand in two places anymore. They had seen the difference between a God who required endless effort and a God who answered in a single moment. Between silence and power. Between illusion and truth. Elijah raised his voice again. "Seize the prophets of Baal," he commanded. "Don't let a single one escape." The mood changed instantly. Moments ago, the people were trembling in awe. Now, they moved with urgency, with purpose. They understood what had to happen next. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a cleansing, a turning point for a nation that had drifted too far. The prophets of Baal, who had led the people into confusion and false worship, were no longer untouchable. They were exposed, powerless. Their voices, once loud and commanding, were now silent. The same silence that had answered them all day. One by one, they were taken. The illusion was over. The deception had been revealed. And for the first time in a long time, truth stood alone, clear, unchallenged. But even after the fire, even after the people's declaration, something was still missing. The land was still dry. The sky was still empty. The drought had not yet ended. The fire had awakened their hearts. But now, they needed rain. And Elijah knew. The story wasn't finished yet. The fire had fallen. The people had returned to God. But the land was still dry. Across Israel, the earth remained cracked and thirsty. Fields lay empty. Rivers were thin. The long drought that had gripped the nation had not yet ended. On the slopes of Mount Carmel, the air was quiet again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not doubt, not confusion, but expectation. At the center of it all stood Elijah. He turned toward Ahab, who had witnessed everything: the failure of Baal, the fire from heaven, and the people falling to their knees. "Go," Elijah said to the king, his voice calm but certain. "Eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Ahab looked up. The sky was still clear. Not a single cloud. No thunder. No wind. Nothing. And yet Elijah spoke as if the rain had already come. Then Elijah turned away from the crowd and walked higher up the mountain. Alone, he knelt down on the ground. He bent low, placing his face between his knees. And he prayed, not loudly, not for show, but with deep, unwavering faith. Then he spoke to his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant ran, climbed, and looked out over the horizon. Then he returned. "There is nothing," he said. Elijah did not move. "Go back," he replied. Again and again, the servant went. Once, twice, 3 times. Still nothing. The sky remained empty. But Elijah did not stop. 6 times the servant returned with the same answer. Nothing. Still Elijah stayed on his knees. Still he prayed. Then, the 7th time, the servant paused. Far out over the sea, something had changed. "It's a cloud," he said slowly, "as small as a man's hand, rising from the sea." That was all Elijah needed. "Go and tell Ahab," Elijah said, rising to his feet. "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The wind began to shift. The sky darkened. Clouds rolled in, growing larger, heavier. Within moments, the heavens opened. Rain poured down across the land. Heavy, relentless, unstoppable. The drought was over. The same God who had answered with fire now answered with rain. And on that day, Israel didn't just witness a miracle. They witnessed restoration. Because when hearts return to God, everything changes. The rain continued to fall over the land. Heavy drops struck the dry ground, soaking into the soil that had been cracked for years. Rivers began to fill again. The scent of fresh earth rose into the air, a sign of life returning. From the heights of Mount Carmel, the people watched in awe. First fire, now rain. Not coincidence, not chance, but answer after answer. At the center of it all stood Elijah. He looked out over the land, not as a man who had proven a point, but as a servant who had simply trusted. That day had never been about winning an argument. It was about revealing the truth. For years, the people had chased after a God who never spoke. They had cried out, performed rituals, sacrificed, and received nothing. But when the true God was called upon, he answered, not slowly, not uncertainly, but with power that could not be ignored. Fire from heaven, rain from the sky, 2 moments that changed everything. The people would remember this day, not just as a miracle, but as a turning point. Because the real battle was never about Baal versus God. It was about the human heart, about choosing who to trust, about deciding what is real and what is empty. As the rain poured down, washing over the land, it felt like more than just water. It felt like renewal, like a second chance, a reminder that no matter how far people drift, they can return. And when they do, they will find that God was never silent, only waiting for the moment when they would finally call on him again. And when they did, he answered.